All right. Um, my name is Katie Young. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I am so happy to be with you guys today. I love Utah State. Go Aggies. I graduated with my bachelor's degree from Utah State, so I love it. I loved my time in Logan. It is an excellent, excellent institution. Um, so without further ado, let's go ahead and just get into it. So I work for an organization called Caring Connections. For those of you who haven't heard of us before, we are small. We are a hope and comfort and grief program that is based at the University of Utah College of Nursing. We were founded in 1997 and serve as a leading community resource for grief and bereavement support in the Intermountain West. So today our presentation is just going to be about sharing tools and knowledge that will help each of you better support grieving people in your lives and communities. And we're going to focus primarily on like suicide loss or overdose loss, right? Losses of that nature. So just a brief overview of what we will cover today. So, we will define grief literacy and explain why it matters. We'll walk through what grief actually looks and feels like for people, including the wide range of reactions people experience when they're grieving. We'll discuss different types of grief, risk factors for complicated grief, and finally, practical ways that you can show up and support someone who is grieving. Um, so before we dive into content, we just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that some of the material today may touch on personal experiences. We'll be discussing death, loss, and bereavement. So if at any point something we are discussing feels particularly activating for you, just do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. Um, it might be really activating. So just a disclaimer here. Um, We'll also be using safe messaging guidelines throughout, so you'll hear me use terms like died by suicide rather than committed suicide, and the person who died rather than loved one. These choices are intentional, and we'll explain more about why language matters in the presentation. So, what is grief? So, grief is a normal human response to loss. Um, the more significant the loss is, the more intense the grief response is likely to be. We don't want to pathologize grief. It's not something that needs to be treated, but it does need to be addressed in some capacity, right? If we're completely ignoring our grief, then that's when we run into problems. So it does need to be addressed, but grief is a normal human response. And what we found is that, most people think that grief happens because there was love involved, and that's definitely true, right? We grieve when we lose something that's important to us, when we lose something that we love. But grief is really rooted in attachment, right? Love can be present, but often the relationships are more complicated than that. And we see situations all the time where maybe there was a estranged family member who died, and there's still grief involved, right? Or maybe it's, a situation where it's a child-parent relationship that was rough, right? And that doesn't mean that there wasn't love, but it's much more directly involved with attachment. Um, so the stages of grief. I'm sure most of us have heard of the stages of grief. These five stages of grief were developed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And this is usually what people think of when I bring up grief. This is, they talk about denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. There's the video on YouTube that has the giraffe that's in quicksand, and he goes through all five stages of grief if you've seen that video. Um, but what we found is that that's not actually accurate. That doesn't really represent the grieving process accurately. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross actually developed these stages of grief when she was focusing on more of the death and dying process. So she never really intended for these stages to be used in the way that they're used today. So instead of the five stages of grief, right, we have all of these five stages up here. They're very clean cut, they're orderly. It's a process you go through. You have a start, you have a finish, and that's it. right? What grief actually looks like is more along the lines of the second image down below, right? Where it's kind of chaotic, it's kind of messy. There's not a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? You experience the loss and then you have the grief with you for the rest of your life. And it's not really predictable, right? If you see on this image, right, there are moments of denial throughout. There are moments of anger throughout. There are big moments of anger. There are moments of bargaining. There are moments of depression and acceptance, right? But it's not this clean cut process. And that can be hard for us to accept, right? We love an efficient process, right? Especially here in America. We love efficiency. We love to get things done. We love to get through it. And so to accept the reality that grief isn't like that, that it doesn't look like that, can be challenging. That can be hard for us. So here's another image, another visual of what grief can look like. Again, we have this image on the left that has the stages of grief, right? We have the loss that happens, and then we kind of go down into this U shape where we hit rock bottom, right? We experience loneliness, guilt, isolation, and then we start working our way up. And then on the other end of that, we have the loss adjustment. We have acceptance. We're over it, right? In reality, grief is much more like this image on the right where the loss happens. You know, we experience shock and then we're over here. Maybe we have moments of hope. Then we have emotional outbursts. Then we're noticing new strengths. Then, we're up here. We feel like we've adjusted. But really, it's just more of a mess, right? It's kind of chaotic. It's kind of crazy. It's unpredictable. And again, that can be challenging for people to accept. So, grief is universal. Meaning that everybody who has lived, everybody currently living, everybody who will live in the future is going to experience grief at some point. They will experience loss, grief, um, and it's just a universal experience. Grief can bring intense suffering. Many people experience that suffering as sadness and sorrow in every area of their life. But grief really does impact every single aspect of our life. It sinks into those parts that maybe we don't really anticipate, right? There are physical sides to grief, there's emotional pieces, intellectual pieces, there are spiritual aspects as well. But acknowledging the universality of grief is the first step toward building a compassionate community. Hopefully, one where nobody has to grieve alone. But just because grief is a universal experience does not mean that there is a universal way to grieve. And this is really important, right? Grief is highly individualized. There are so many different factors that go into the grieving process and how we cope when we have grief. Um, but that's why it can be really disruptive, especially to families, right? When a family experiences a loss, every member of that family is grieving. And so if you're grieving in a different way than your sister, right? If you're sad all the time and you're crying all the time and your sister isn't, right? That first reaction is for us to say, well, my sister didn't care. My sister didn't love this person the way that I did, right? And so it can be really disruptive to families because everyone's grieving, right? But it's an individualized process and we all grieve differently. Something else that a lot of us don't really know is that grief does not stop, right? Many people expect grief to follow kind of that predictable arc that ends with closure, usually within weeks or months of the loss, but that's not how it works, right? There's no finish line here. Grief changes over time. It may soften, it may shift, it may integrate, but it doesn't disappear. Grievers don't get over it. They carry their loss forward. And our grief really does stay with us for the rest of our lives. Um, One of the most harmful things that people can do when talking to a griever is to set a timeline for grief for that griever, right? Oh, just wait until the first year's over, right? Once the first year's over, you'll be fine, right? It's been over 5 years. Aren't you over it yet? Why aren't you over it yet? Right? Those are things that a lot of us say, a lot of us have heard, and those aren't helpful. And they can be really, really deeply invalidating for the person who is grieving. So, grief is, um, grief is a lot of things, and it means a lot of different things for people. But something that we don't talk about enough is that grief, while it's a reminder about the death, it's also awkward, right? It's also scary. It's also uncomfortable, right? It's also vulnerable. These are all things that grief is. And because of that, you know, it's hard for people to interact with a grieving person, right? It's awkward for us to sit there and watch somebody cry. It's scary to know that somebody may be having thoughts or feelings about ending their own life or that the world may be better off without them, right? It's uncomfortable. We aren't used to seeing such, obvious suffering. Most of us aren't used to that. So, and it's okay. It's okay to feel this way about grief. It's okay to feel this way with a grieving person. If you have somebody that you're working with and you feel awkward, right? You don't know what to say, you don't know what to do, but you're there with them, right? The fact that you're there with them, even though you're doing it awkward and scared and all of those things, is really, really important. So that's just something to keep in mind. So there are lots of myths surrounding grief. For instance, one size fits all. We know that this isn't the case, right? Grief is highly individualized. One size definitely does not fit all. And it really just depends on a person's circumstances, how they're going to respond to their grief. Um, Another myth is that one day predicts the next day, right? You can have a really good day today and tomorrow might be hell, right? There's no predictability there. It's kind of crazy, it's kind of chaotic. Um, and the unpredictable nature of it is really challenging, right? Another myth is that there are magic words, right? There's right things to say. You got to find the right thing to say. If you don't find that right thing to say, then you shouldn't say anything, right? And that's not true. There's no right words. There's nothing that you can say that will fix the hurt that this person is feeling. There's nothing you can say that will resolve the pain, right? But we don't want to resolve that pain, right? The griever needs to feel that. That pain is really important. It's crucial. Um, so yeah, those are just some of the myths that we have. So what grievers experience? So again, grief is highly individualized. Factors that affects one person's grief process can include, the nature of the loss itself, right, to the person. Was it sudden? Was it expected? Was it traumatic? Right? And even if it isn't traumatic, by definition, for whatever reason, to the community, right? It doesn't mean that it wasn't traumatic to that person, right? So the nature of the loss to the person will influence their grieving process. The individual's personality, are they naturally introverted or extroverted? How do they typically cope, right? Are they really extroverted and so they are surrounded by people, they have community, they have support that they need? Maybe they're more introverted, right? Maybe they're more private. Maybe they aren't willing to talk about it because it's vulnerable and uncomfortable, right? But whatever the case may be, their own personality is going to influence their grief process. Cultural and family norms, right? What does their community say about how grief should look? Right? There are some cultures that are fabulous grievers. There are some cultures that really understand that they need to go through that loss. They need to process that loss. They need to feel all of those feelings. Here in the United States, we are not as good at grieving. We get a grand total of 3 days of bereavement leave from our jobs. We expect people to get right back at it and get back to work. And, if they get back to work, they'll feel better, right? So, what does our culture say to us about grief? That's going to impact how a person grieves. Other stressors in the person's life at the time of the loss, is this person also dealing with financial hardship? Are they dealing with illness themselves? Maybe they have caregiving demands on top of the loss, right? This is all going to impact their grieving process. And then a history coping with other losses. We know that when we go through a loss, when we experience grief, it brings up past losses for us, for people. It brings up past emotional responses from past loss. Um, and so that is also going to influence somebody. And just because somebody has gone through many losses does not mean that this loss is going to be the same, right? It doesn't mean that this grieving process is going to be the same for that person, right? So just keep that in mind that grief changes for people and it's highly individualized, and there are so many different factors that influence a person's grieving process. So this is an image that was created by the artist Mari Andrew. And the reason why we include it is that it does a really great job of showing grief as a shapeshifter, right? So over time, grief does tend to change, right? It doesn't go away, but it does change. And maybe when the loss first happened, we start out with this big, bulky bag, right? It's heavy, it's awkward to carry, it's hard to deal with, it's hard to see around it, right? While you're carrying it, it's maybe more obvious to people around us that we're carrying this huge burden, right? And then, over time, hopefully it gets to be a little bit more manageable where it's more like the purse at the end there, where you're wearing it better, right? It's still with you and you still think about it and you can't leave it somewhere, right? You got to take it with you. It requires your attention from time to time. But I also like to point out that just because you get to this place where maybe you're carrying it a little bit easier, it doesn't mean that, on the anniversary of the death, that it doesn't turn back into this big, bulky bag for the day, right? It can feel a lot heavier on those days or during, milestone moments, the graduation of a child, uh, the first Christmas, whatever that looks like, right? Whatever holidays you celebrate. Um, grief can change. So grief may be past, present, or anticipatory. Um, and I think that this slide is helpful because it just shows us that grief changes, right? Again, it it looks different for different people. Its focus is different. For different people, grief can be loud, it can be visible, or it can be quiet and hidden. It can show up in a lot of different ways as sadness, numbness, anger, relief, or something that doesn't have a name. Um, but none of these responses are wrong. Whatever your grief is, whatever it looks like for you, um, that's what it is, right? There's no right or wrong here. So again, factors. So these are the factors that are going to affect a person's ability to cope with loss, right? So again, we have the nature of the relationship, right? Maybe it was a really difficult, challenging relationship for that person, even though it was their parent or even though it was their child, right? Maybe there were factors involved, especially in the case of like an overdose loss, right? Those tend to be really complicated situations. So what does that look like, right? The nature of the death or multiple deaths, right? Maybe there's more than one, right? That's going to impact a person's ability to cope. Also, the circumstances of the death. So, if it was sudden, if it was a prolonged illness, if it was traumatic, um, like in the instance of a suicide, um, did they witness the death? Did they find the person after the death? Um, these are all things that are going to influence a person's ability to cope. Other things that might come up are, causal factors, right? What does that grieving person view to be the cause of that death, right? Whether it's true or not, if they believe something, that's going to influence their ability to cope. Um, Also, any prior mental health history, history of loss, their culture, their religion, their spiritual beliefs. Those are really big ones, especially when it comes to a suicide loss. Um, Most religions do have a complicated view of suicide, um, and frankly, most of them are problematic. Um, but that's going to influence how well a person is coping, right? If they belong to an organized religion that views it as a sin or views it as, this person's going to suffer in hell for the rest of their existence because they took their own life, right? That's going to be incredibly problematic for that person. And which can lead to another loss, right? If that person decides that their spiritual community, their religious community is not helping them and they choose to take a step back from that, that's just another loss, right? It's another loss on top of the loss. So, one thing to note too is that most people, given sufficient time and social support and coping skills, are capable of navigating grief. And we know that about 90% of people are able to kind of get through the initial loss okay, and they're able to navigate grief on their own. It's only about 10% of people that really end up struggling with complicated grief or prolonged grief disorder. So just keep that in mind is that most of us do okay. So natural grief reactions include guilt, shame, blame and anger, anxiety, fear, and isolation. Um, and when I teach this, when we do this presentation in the community, oftentimes people will be surprised by some of these, right? Some of them feel a little bit more obvious, right? But I think a lot of people are surprised to see kind of the range here of what we're dealing with when somebody's grieving, and that this is considered normal. Right? I think that a lot of people tend to see some of these things and they think, oh, well, that's a red flag. That needs help. That means that that person needs extra support. And that's not necessarily true, right? All of these are normal grief responses. Um, Guilt is a huge one. People think about all the things that they could have done differently. They should have done more. That's a really big one, especially in the case of a suicide. And shame. Shame is also really huge when it comes to a suicide. But our initial response to a loss is usually shock. Shock acts as a protective factor for us in that moment. Our brains get that information and it says, whoa, we can't handle this right now. And so we go into this state of shock. Usually it lasts a couple of months for people, but that all depends on the person and the situation. Um, so especially in the event of if the death was sudden or unexpected or traumatic, like suicide, like overdose. Maybe it was an accident, maybe it was a homicide. Um, but the shock stays with us for a couple months while we kind of work through that initial loss. In the case of a suicide, it's likely going to feel like the death was unnatural, like the death was preventable, like the death was meaningless. Many suicide loss survivors and overdose loss survivors feel that. They feel that the death was not supposed to happen, that it wasn't their time, that this wasn't the natural order of things, which can be hard. That can be really challenging to feel that, right? Because when somebody dies from natural causes, right? It's much easier for us to accept that, especially if they die when they're older, right? They've lived a good long life. They've had, their life, they've had their families, they've had their careers, they've had their chance to live, right? That's usually a little bit easier for us to accept than in the event of like a suicide loss that was, preventable, right? That's how a lot of us feel about it. So just keep that in mind when working with somebody who's experienced a suicide loss or an overdose loss, is that they're probably feeling like this. Guilt. Guilt is a huge one. Um, it's a huge one. It's one of the most painful responses to loss that we have. Grievers often ask themselves, what could I have done differently? Did I miss warning signs? Did I say the wrong thing? Should I have done something different? Um, our brains love solutions, right? We want to know what we can do to prevent this from happening again. And so it's really common for us to really focus on that and ruminate and think, what could I have done differently? What could I have done differently? Right? Our brains are looking for that solution. Um, and it's normal to feel that. It's normal to feel guilty. Um, I want to point out that guilt can come up even if it's not warranted, right? In most cases, especially with suicide, um, even though they're feeling guilty, even though they're feeling responsible, that's not necessarily true. But because they have that perceived sense of guilt, because it is perceived to them, that is impacting them, right? They believe that that is real for them. So just keep that in mind too, that the guilt is there, it's present. Um, it's really present when it comes to a suicide, but it also may occur in the case of, a caregiver who's lost their person, right? If they're caring for somebody, it's been a long illness, whatever that looks like, that person dies, right? They may feel a sense of relief and then they may feel guilty for feeling that relief. But yeah, it's a very, very common response. Shame. So shame is really interesting. Um, Shame comes up a lot, especially if it's a stigmatized death. So especially in the cases of overdose, suicide, there's going to be that stigma, there's going to be that shame. And because of that, they're going to feel more isolated, right? People aren't going to reach out to these people in the same way as if the death had happened in really any other way, right? The community response is going to be different. The response from family and friends is going to be different. The response from, even schools, right? We see that all the time where, a student takes their own life, dies by suicide. And the response to that loss is incredibly different than if, the student had died in another way. So yeah, there is a lot of shame, right? And one of our goals with this grief literacy is to hopefully get to a place where there's less shame, right? Where we can remove some of that shame. We aren't putting shame on the survivors here. But yeah, it's there. And society's messages about how people die also create more shame, right? Oftentimes, people who die by overdose are labeled as failures, right? They're labeled as a drain on society, right? They weren't doing what they needed to do. Sorry, I don't know why my slides keep running away from me there. Um, but yeah, so shame is a huge piece here. Blame. So, uh, it's really natural to blame somebody else in the event of a loss, right? Especially if it's sudden or traumatic, right? We want to point the finger at anybody else. We want to find the reason. We want to find the cause. This is your fault. This isn't this isn't my fault. This isn't the person who died. It's not their fault, right? And we can feel like we want to blame anybody, right? We can blame other family members, medical professionals, God or the universe, right? And sometimes we can even want to blame the person who died. Um, I worked with a family and their son died by suicide, and the mother just kept pointing the finger back at those doctors. And she would spend hours looking up videos of people who had died in the same way. And she would say, look, this person lived. Why didn't my son live? These doctors wanted to kill my son. These doctors didn't work hard enough. These doctors, that was who she wanted to blame, and you couldn't tell her any different. You couldn't say, well, actually, he died because of this or whatever, That's not where she was. She was in this and she needed somebody to blame, and those doctors just happened to be the person that she chose. Um, People who are affected by a drug overdose death should avoid blaming the person who died and avoid self-blame. However, that's incredibly difficult. It's super common. But seeing like a grief counselor or going to a support group can help, especially a support group that is focused on overdose loss. That can be really helpful. Anger. So, anger is a frequently misunderstood grief response. Many people and many communities don't know how to hold space for an angry griever. Um, Again, grief and anger can be directed at, the person who died, how could you leave me? It can be directed at God or their faith, how could you let this happen? It can be directed at the healthcare system, other family members. It can be directed at themselves. Um, but for some reason, when people are angry, a lot of us want to jump in with some spiritual advice. I don't know why that is. Perhaps it's because it brings us peace when we are feeling upset and activated. Um, but we would caution against that, unless the person is, coming to you themselves and saying, like, hey, like, help me through this. What do you think? And they're asking for spiritual advice, right? We advise that you kind of stay away from that if at all possible. Premature spiritual guidance can provoke frustration. It can bring up more anger. It can bring up guilt. And really, an effective, compassionate listener is going to allow space for the expression of anger, right? Anger, frustration, tears, all of those things, even if you're uncomfortable with it, right? We're just providing a safe space. We're sitting with them in this grief. We are witnessing their pain. And that's really what most grievers need. So, isolation. Isolation is one of the most dangerous consequences of grief. Grievers often will withdraw, and the people around them will often pull away. Um, there's a lot of reasons for this, but the primary one is that they're uncomfortable and they don't know what to say and they don't want to say the wrong thing. Um, but grieving people need people. They need connection, right? Which is hard when all you want to do is isolate, all you want to do is pull away and be alone and sit in your feelings and do whatever you need to do. We need people, we need connection. And so part of being grief literate is understanding this that, they still need us, right? And maybe they're in a moment right now where they need to be alone, but we need to keep checking on them. We need to keep coming back to this. So just keep that in mind, especially with suicide loss. Um, Acquaintances really pull away. They don't know what to say. It's really uncomfortable. It's, you know, there's a stigma associated with it. Or they want to know more, right? They want to ask, those questions of, well, how did they die? How did they do it? Right? It almost feels on the gossipy end. And that's not helpful either. So, just just keep that in mind, right? We need to be careful about what we say and how we respond, but we'll talk more about that. So this is the dual process model of grief. Um, this is what we use at Caring Connections when we teach people about grief. This is the model that we've chosen. We love this model. It's excellent. But just looking at this um, diagram here, right, we can see that there are the two circles. Those are the two processes that we are going through when we're grieving. That's why it's called the dual process. There are two. But we have on the left-hand side, we have the loss-oriented coping. This is everything that's focused on the loss, right? So this is the emotional response to the loss. This is thinking about the person. This is grieving the person. This is thinking about those memories, whether they're pleasant or unpleasant. Anything that's associated with the loss is in the loss-oriented coping. And then on the right, we have the restoration-oriented coping. These are all the tasks and things that are focused with, moving forward, right? The practical tasks of life. So we have things like grocery shopping, planning what to buy and eat for the week, right? Learning how to pay the mortgage when your spouse who died was the one who paid the mortgage, right? That's all located in restoration-oriented coping. And then the really important part of this model is the oscillation between these two processes. So we have that back and forth movement between loss-oriented and restoration-oriented coping, and that is really crucial here. Um, and it can feel really abrupt, right? It can be from moment to moment that one moment you're here over in loss oriented, you're focused on that loss, you're feeling sad. And then the next moment you're like, oh, gee, I need to call so and so about that thing, right? And then you're back to feeling, that loss oriented coping, right? But this movement between these two processes is what healthy grief looks like. This is what we need. So when we don't have that movement, that's when we get into trouble. That's when we get stuck, and that's a problem. And then off to the right-hand side of this model, you'll see that there is also taking a break from grief. And that is an essential part of grieving as well. So we need to take a break from grief in order to have the energy necessary to come back and engage in these processes again. But that can be really difficult for people. You tell them to take a break from grief, and they're like, I can't take a break from grief. Right? This was my person. What do you mean? I miss them. I love them. I want them to be here. I can't go out to lunch with a friend and have a good time. What does that say about me? Right? It's really challenging to convince people that they need that break, but it's really important, really essential. So the goal with grief is not to get rid of it. It's not to even really move away from it. It's to integrate it. Um, we want to integrate it into our lives. And that can look like imagining life without the deceased. Um, what does that future look like now? Uh, that can look like reinvesting love and care into.
Hey there, period. I am so sorry to do this, but I
Um, if anybody has a question, by the way, you're welcome to interrupt me at any point. So just you can throw it in the chat, you can unmute, whatever you need to do. Um, but anyway, so grief integration can also look like reinvesting love and care into new relationships, new meaningful pursuits. It can look like continuing bonds. So a lot of people think, oh, we need to move on from this person who died. We need to, forget about them. We can't keep them with us. But that's not actually true. In healthy grief, integrated grief, we want to maintain those bonds with that person, the deceased person, whatever that looks like for you, right? A lot of people will talk to them. They'll just talk out loud to the person who died. They'll have rituals in place to remember them, on the anniversary of their passing, maybe on their birthday, maybe during major holidays. They'll have, whatever that looks like. But we want to, keep those bonds in place. Those bonds are really, really important. And then meaning making, asking, how do I make sense of this? What does it mean for how I live now? Right? Meaning making is one of the major tasks of grief. It's really important. It's essential in grief integration. So, whatever that looks like, it can look like a lot of different things for a lot of different people. But I want to point out if you look at this picture here, this is what it can feel like when we're grieving, right? We're just going in circles. We aren't making any progress. We're just stuck. But what's actually happening is that while we're grieving, we're actually moving upwards, right? We're having this movement that is happening. And it's this is the progress, right? So even though it feels like we are stuck, we're still in the same place. We can't see our progress. We don't understand that we've made progress, right? This is what's actually happening. And so being able to point that out to people of like, well, actually, you're doing great, right? Like, look at how far you've come since he died back in May, right? You're doing excellent, right? This can be really helpful because from the outside can see it a little bit easier than the person who is involved in the grief. So just keep that in mind. So again, integrated grief is the goal. Um, Integrated grief is described as the permanent response after adaptation to the loss, in which satisfaction is ongoing life and is renewed. So that's the definition of integrated grief. This means that the griever can think of the person who died without being completely overwhelmed. That means that the griever can re-engage with relationships and life with meaning. And they can carry the loss as part of their story without it dominating everything, right? It's just another piece of their story. It's not the whole story. This takes time. Integrating grief, there's no shortcut, and it looks different for everyone. So, coming back to that dual process model of grief, again, when we don't have the oscillation, that's when we run into issues. That's when we can end up with prolonged grief disorder or complicated grief, and we get stuck, right? And I've had so many people tell me, well, if I can get stuck in that restoration-oriented coping, then I'm golden, right? I can just move on. I can pull myself up by my bootstraps and I can just focus on the future and I'm set, right? That's all I need. And that's not actually the case, right? Stuck is stuck, and stuck isn't good. So even if we're stuck over here in restoration-oriented coping, it's still not good for us. We need both processes. We need to have moments where we can focus on that loss and process that grief, that emotional pain. We need moments where we can focus on the future, right? And then, of course, we need the breaks from the grief as well. But this oscillation is really, 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 really important. So, individuals that are at a high risk for problematic grief, um, people who have had a conflicted or ambivalent relationship with the person who died, that's putting them at risk. Those who experienced a sudden traumatic or violent loss, right? So, most people who have experienced a suicide loss are going to be in this category. Um, they didn't have time to prepare for it. It feels really meaningless. It feels preventable. It feels shocking. It's traumatic. It's horrific, right? All of these things, this is going to put them into that high risk category. Um, People with limited social support. So we need people. People play a really important role for us. They offer a lot of support for us while we grieve. So those people who don't have a lot of people in their lives, are going to be at a higher risk. Those who have experienced multiple losses in a short period of time, they're at a much higher risk than somebody who just experiences one loss. I worked with a woman and she had lost two out of her three kids within 6 months of each other, and she was experiencing complicated grief. Um, but it's just it compounds, right? That emotional pain just becomes something that you can't manage, right? And that's when you might need some additional support, some professional support. Um, Individuals who have mental health challenges, including depression or anxiety, they're at a higher risk. Children and young adults are at a higher risk. Oftentimes, they just don't have the necessary tools to be able to cope. And then bereaved parents and those who have lost a child are at a higher risk. So Caring Connections, we offer specialized support groups for many of these populations, including groups for suicide loss, overdose loss, loss of a child, and loss of a spouse. Um, we offer virtual groups as well as in person. Um, So knowing that you guys are in Logan, if you have anybody who wants to join those groups, we do offer virtual options. We don't offer groups for teens or kids yet, but we do know other places that do. So we are always happy to help. You can reach out to us and we're happy to send resources to you, if that would be helpful at any point. So risk for a poor grief outcome. So these things are what we see the most in people who have a poor grief outcome. So an overwhelming sense of loss, right? Nothing left. That was their everything. This person, this relationship, whatever it was, this was their everything, and now they don't have anything left. Overwhelming emotions, right? As well as, pre-morbid depression or anxiety, just meaning before the loss, they were already struggling with the depression or anxiety. Isolation, right? Or perceived aloneness, right? So it doesn't really matter if they're not actually alone, if they believe that they're alone, if they feel alone, that's just as detrimental as actually being isolated. And then others' expectations,
Right.
right? Putting expectations on other people. Those can be problematic oftentimes. So it's essential that we notice these things. And, if we are noticing these things, that we offer additional support, whatever that looks like. 988 is a great resource. I hope you all are aware of it. You probably are. I'm preaching to the choir here. But 988 is a hotline where people can call if they're in an emotional or mental health crisis. And they can call and talk to somebody. So let's talk about prolonged grief for a minute. Prolonged grief was added to the DSM in the most recent edition before it was known as complicated grief. But prolonged grief disorder is characterized by an intense and persistent state of bereavement for the person who died that interferes with daily functioning and relationships and does not change in intensity over many months. It is a persistent, unrelenting grief. So, key markers include intense longing for the person who died, difficulty accepting the reality of the death, avoidance of reminders or excessive preoccupation with reminders, inability to engage in normal activities or relationships, and the intensity does not diminish with time. So, that's what the DSM says about prolonged grief. Um, but yeah, just something to keep on your radar. So let's talk for a minute about ambiguous loss. So ambiguous loss is a type of loss that lacks clear definition or social recognition. And again, we really love defined things. We love clear processes. And so when we are faced with a complicated emotional situation like an ambiguous loss, where it is unclear, unspecified, we don't really understand, what's happening, why it happened. That can be really challenging for us. That can pose a lot of problems for grievers because it's harder to move forward. It's harder to get to that place where we can integrate that grief. Um, so with ambiguous loss, it was coined by the psychologist Pauline Boss, who used it to describe two types of losses, right? So there's the first type, which is a physical absence with a psychological presence. So that could be situations like a missing person, or a soldier in a war, or a divorce, or immigration, or a child leaving for college, right? These are all situations where physically they're not present, but they are taking a lot of space in our minds, in our psychological space, right? We're missing them. We're grieving that loss. And then the second type is psychological absence with physical presence. So that's where, that can be a family member with Alzheimer's disease or another type of dementia. That can be somebody struggling with severe drug addiction or somebody dealing with like a traumatic brain injury or brain cancer. right? Those are all types of situations where physically they're here with us, but psychologically they're not. They're not here. And again, they're hard to define, right? They're hard to explain, they're hard to understand, and that creates problems. Um, for many grievers, the loss of someone to overdose or addiction involves ambiguous loss long before the death. Years of loving somebody whose disease made them gone in many ways while still physically present. Um, so these people are already grieving the loss of a lot of these people who are experiencing, death by overdose eventually, or death by suicide. These losses are often invisible to others, which compounds the grief. So let's talk about disenfranchised grief. And it feels very similar to ambiguous loss. Um, but disenfranchised grief occurs when a person's grief is not socially acknowledged, validated, or supported. So this can happen when, the relationship isn't recognized. So in the event of like the death of a close friend, the death of an ex-partner, the death of a coworker, right? Those are all situations where, they're not going to receive the same kind of support as other losses. If the loss is stigmatized, right? It's a stigmatized type, meaning suicide, overdose, incarceration, right? If any of that is involved, they're not going to receive the same support as another loss. Or if the griever is not seen as having the right to grieve. So, an example of that would be children are told that they're too young, that they don't understand, they don't have a right to grieve. Um, and then another example would be if the death occurred under circumstances other people find shameful or confusing. That's very disenfranchised. Um, and, our role, our hope is that we can get to a place where we can prevent disenfranchisement, right? That we can recognize every grief as valid. So, how do the two go hand in hand? Because they really do, they go together. So, in disenfranchised grief, the grief is not endorsed socially, and the grief is not supported. And in the experience of ambiguous loss, there may be a lack of clarity or understanding related to the circumstances of the death, leading to uncertainty about how to move forward or how to offer support. So, what happens is we have an ambiguous loss, right? It's not clearly defined. It may be uncomfortable, it may be shameful, it may be, not something that we talk about, right? Like a suicide. Um, so we have that happen, and people immediately withdraw, right? They don't want to get involved. They don't know how to proceed. They don't know what to say. They don't know how to act. They don't know what would help. They don't want to make it worse. And because of that withdrawal, um, that was, motivated by the fact that people don't know how to respond in this situation because it's an ambiguous loss, right? That leads to disenfranchised grief, right? They're not offering support. They're not acknowledging it. They're not talking about it. They're not allowing the person to talk about it, right? So the two really do go hand in hand. Our work in grief literacy is in part about expanding the circle of recognition of grief. So what we want to do is we want to, tell people that their grief counts, right? Your loss matters. You deserve support, right? You deserve to grieve. This is really hard, right? Just even allowing them that space to talk about it is so impactful and so important. So if we look at this slide here, um, how to know when more help is needed, right? So we have this pyramid of loss over here. And what we see is down here at the bottom, we have a community loss that is distal to the individual, right? So it's a distance away. It's not right there. It's not intimate. They're not super involved with this person. This is like the types of losses that we see on the news, right? Where we may know the family or we may know the person, but probably not super well, right? But they're a part of our community. And so we see that this loss happened. We feel sad. We have an emotional response to that, right? But with collective support resources and referrals and grief literacy education, right? This person who experienced this loss is probably going to be just fine, right? This is probably all that they're going to need to to get through it. Um, so as you move up the pyramid here, you can see that the top is intimate loss with trauma. So that is, the most intense loss, right? And as we move up with the intensity here, the support becomes more, it becomes greater, right? It's likely that these people are going to need more support the more the loss, impacted them. Um, So yeah, just something to keep in mind. Other things to keep an eye on is, if the grief doesn't diminish in intensity over many months. So the kind of the qualifier for prolonged grief disorder is, the loss was over a year ago. So that might be a good kind of marker. If it's been over a year and they're still, reacting to the loss like it's the day of the loss, right? That's an indication that they probably need more support. An inability to function at work, school, or home, right? Another red flag. Social isolation and withdrawal, thoughts of suicide or self-harm, severe depression, hopelessness or worthlessness, unrelenting insomnia. We know that we process a lot of our grief while we sleep. So if they're not sleeping, they're not working through their grief. And if they're not sleeping, they aren't going to have what they need to cope to get through, the toughest part of the loss, that most intense grief that they experience at the beginning. So if somebody isn't sleeping, it's important to get them some additional help. Um, if somebody is self-medicating with, alcohol or medication in a way that's inappropriate or excessive, that's a red flag. And traumatic loss without adequate support. So if it is like a suicide loss, a loss to overdose, and they don't have any support, um, that's a good indication that they're going to need support. And we should, do what we can to get them the support that they need. Um, so preventing disenfranchised grief. So this is one of the things that we hope that we can start doing. We can start moving away from just disenfranchised grief. Um, so that means what we need to do is we need to recognize and validate their grief, right? This means acknowledging the loss directly. That can look like, I heard about the death of your person. I'm so sorry. Um, Not avoiding the topic because it's uncomfortable, right? Bringing it up, giving them a chance to talk about it. Not imposing a timeline, right? You should be over it by now, right? That's not helpful. Not minimizing the loss. So saying things like, at least they're not suffering. At least you can have more kids. At least you're young. At least you don't have to take care of her anymore, right? All of those things are really invalidating and really detrimental. And then honoring the relationship, even if it was complicated or not legally recognized. So we used to see this a lot, with queer couples. Sometimes we still do, where, the majority of their relationship wasn't acknowledged, it wasn't valid, right? Because, they couldn't get married legally. So even though it was their spouse in every way that mattered, a lot of people don't recognize that, right? So when the loss did happen, um, it was really easily disenfranchised. So just keep that in mind, right? We want to validate everybody's grief. All grief is valid. They're allowed to have the emotional response that they're having. So, rituals and traditions are so important in grief. They create structure when everything feels chaotic, and they offer community acknowledgement of a significant loss. So, rituals may include things like the funeral, memorial services and celebrations of life, cultural and religious mourning practices, annual observances like the death anniversaries, or Days of the Dead. And then personal rituals such as, lighting a candle for the person who died, visiting a grave, cooking a favorite meal, going to a place that was significant. Rituals are so important. They allow us to maintain those bonds with the deceased, and they also allow us a chance to have our grief shared, um, and have it be acknowledged by others, which is really important. When people are denied rituals because the death was stigmatized, the relationship was unrecognized, or the person was maybe far away, right? Grief can become disenfranchised, which is not what we want. So at Caring Connections, we do offer several events throughout the year. We have one that is called Grief in the Holidays, and it's just a space where people can come and remember their person who died, with other people who are grieving, um, during the holidays. We usually have it in November, and it's free and it's lovely. So, if somebody is struggling, with disenfranchised grief, they aren't feeling acknowledged, finding events like that can be really helpful. So, meaning making. Meaning making is one of the central tasks of grief. It asks, how do I make sense of this loss? What does it mean for who I am and how I live? It's not about finding the silver lining or justifying the death. It's about integrating the loss into one's life story in a way that allows forward movement. So, this can look like finding purpose and honoring the person who died, redirecting love and energy into causes related to the loss. So, like for instance, I worked with a woman whose husband died, from Alzheimer's, and she got involved with the Alzheimer's Association, and that was one way that she created meaning in that loss for herself. Um, Identifying ways that the relationship has changed or shaped you, that can create meaning, and then connecting with others who share the loss. So, getting together with people, who maybe knew this person, who had a relationship with this person, and you can, share that grief together. But that can also look like getting with people who have experienced a similar loss, right? It's not the same person, it's not the same loss, but if you lose a child, especially if it's to suicide, right? Getting together with other people who have also lost a child or lost a child to suicide is going to be incredibly helpful, right? You can talk to them about their loss and their experience, and they'll get it in a way that nobody else can, which is really, really helpful. So, what does support look like? So, supporting grievers exists in multiple levels and layers. Um, No single person or resource can or should have to carry all of that, right? You shouldn't be putting yourself in a situation where you are the sole source of support for somebody. Um, that's not sustainable for you, and it's not good for the griever, right? We need lots of support. We need, you hear it takes a village, and it does. It's important. Um, so layers of support include care providers. This can be hospice companies, um, hospital social workers, chaplains, nurses, whoever was a part of that care team that helped with that person, in their death, they can be great sources of support. Um, Significant others, so spouses, partners, closest family members, um, again, another layer of support, which is so important. And then there's friends and family, and the broader social network, whatever that looks like, colleagues, um, people that you interact with, on a regular basis. And then professional support. So that includes like grief counselors, therapists, psychiatrists, support groups, that kind of support. Um, yeah, support. It's really important. So remember, it's not our job to take away the pain of the bereaved. Um, I love this slide. I think that this is really, really crucial. It's so easy for us to avoid when there has been a death, when there is somebody grieving, and it's like, well, I don't know what to say to fix this. I don't know how to help them. I don't know how to take away their pain. But that's not the goal, right? The person who is grieving needs to feel that pain. It's not up to us to take it away. It's not even possible for us to take it away. That's not the goal. Our goal is to sit with them in their pain. Remember, there aren't any magic words to make it better. What they need is for their pain to be witnessed, for their grief to be acknowledged. Um, a lot of people will report that their pets were the most helpful sources of support for them in their grief. And I really do think that it's because pets are the best at just sitting with us, right? When we're sad, our dogs will come and sit with us and lick our faces, right? Or our cat will come and sit on our lap. But whatever the case, right? We need to be able to sit with them. These people need to feel like they're not alone in their grief. So there are no right words. There are no magic words that can fix this, but there are things that we can say that might be harmful, that might not be helpful. So, uh, some of the things that come out are wrong, and these usually come out when we don't know what to say, right? When we are trying to be helpful, but we're unsure how to be helpful. When we're uncomfortable with silence and suffering, right? We'll say things like, "Oh, well, at least they're in a better place," right? Or we're projecting our own fears about death and loss. Um, and then falling back on cultural scripts that don't actually serve grievers. So again, at least they're in a better place. At least you can have another child. At least you don't have to take care of her anymore, right? All of those things are causing harm. They're not helping. Um, but the solution here is to be willing to try and learn and be present anyway, right? Even though you might say something that is harmful or hurtful, um, that is much better than withdrawing for fear of saying the wrong thing, right? Because we don't want you to do that either. So here are some words that can help versus harm. So, for instance, phrases to avoid. So, passed away, left us, no longer with us, right? That's unclear, right? If you tell a child that grandpa passed away, that might not be clear to him. If you tell a child that we lost them, that we lost grandma or grandpa, that child is going to think that they're lost, right? That they're literally lost. So, what we encourage people to say instead is they died, right? Just be clear, just be upfront about it, right? We avoid using the term loved one because we don't know what that relationship was like for the grieving person. So instead, we encourage people to use the term, the person who died, your person, the individual who died. You can use their name, right? Whatever that looks like for you is better than saying loved one. And people default to loved one all the time. You see it on everything. And that might not be an accurate description for somebody if it was a complicated relationship. So here we're at committed suicide, successful or unsuccessful attempt. When we use the term committed, we use that word when we're talking about, we committed a crime or we committed a sin, right? Whether you believe that's the case or not, right? We're going to encourage you to say died by suicide. or they experienced a suicide death, right? That's way more accurate, way more helpful. It removes the judgment from that statement, right? Because committed suicide just implies all kinds of things that are not helpful for the person who is grieving. Um, and just to go along with that, the word triggered, right? We don't use that just because it has, you know, it's associated with weapons, with guns, right? Triggered. Um, but really what's happening is when we're quote unquote triggered, we're experiencing activation, right? Our nervous systems are activating. We're having an emotional response to something. And so we prefer the term activated, right? Or it brought up a strong emotional response in me, or it intensified my grief, right? But steering clear of triggered is going to be helpful. And then, we want to avoid talking about the details of the method, especially in the case of a suicide. Um, we saw when, 13 Reasons Why was popular on Netflix when, that everybody was watching it, right? For those of you who don't know, that shows a teenage girl plan her suicide and then, go through with it. Um, and we saw an increase in suicides after that because of that. Because, they showed the suicide, they showed the method, they showed her plan, they showed all of it. And additionally, the same thing happened when Robin Williams died, right? Um, when that was all over the news, we saw an increase in suicides. So our words really do matter. And, talking about the method could actively lead to, somebody else's harm or death or all of those things. So we want to avoid that at all possible. It's not helpful. It's not important. Right. So sticking with died by suicide is usually what we recommend. Okay. What helps and what does not help? So actively listening is great. Telling people your grief story is less helpful. And that feels like a good option because it's like, okay, well, we're connecting, right? Like my loss is similar to this person's loss. Like it's both loss. Like we can connect and we can bond over this, right? But it's not helpful. Um, it can feel like you're making it all about you. It can feel like you're invalidating their loss. It's not helpful. So we recommend that you steer clear of that. Um, You can share memories of the person who died with them, right? If you have your own memories, that is a wonderful thing to do, and that is so helpful. Letting the griever tell the story of the death, and more importantly, the life of the deceased. So letting that person have the chance to tell that story. Um, Most grievers don't feel like they can share the story of the death. They don't feel like it's appropriate for most social situations, especially if it included a suicide or an overdose death. Um, so giving them that space to do that is going to be so helpful and so impactful. Comforts and kindness, safe social activities, those are helpful. Confidence that they can manage, telling them, hey, I know you can do this, right? I know that you can do this. I know that this is so hard, but you're doing a wonderful job, right? That can be really, really helpful. A referral for professional support when appropriate is helpful. Helping with practicalities like, cleaning the house, mowing the lawn, having groceries delivered, um, having a meal delivered. Those are all things that can be helpful for somebody who's grieving. Um, and then helping people remember. We know that when we are grieving, our cognitive functioning is impacted, right? Our frontal lobe kind of goes offline when we're grieving. We move into the more emotional parts of our brain. And so it's really hard to remember information. It's really hard to remember what day it is. It's really hard to remember appointments, all of those things. It becomes that much more difficult when you're grieving. And that's just a part of the grieving process. So, don't think that something's wrong if you're grieving and you're having a hard time, even with things like word finding, that can be a part of the grief. I always say that if you are experiencing that though and you're alarmed by it, that it's always good to get it checked out by a doctor, just in case, just to rule something out. But grief does impact us that way. Um, so inappropriately giving premature spiritual support, that's never helpful. If somebody asks you for that, that's great. But unless they ask, I would steer clear. Suggesting or offering medications, including sleeping meds, that can be problematic. Don't do it. Assuming there is one right way to grieve, gossip, minimizing their suffering, and focusing on the circumstances of the death. These are all things that are not going to help the grieving person. So, something that we like to tell people is, if you don't know what to do, just ask, right? What would help you? What would help you now? Do you need help? Do you need to feel heard? Do you need a hug? Right? These take the guesswork out of it, right? You don't have to assume. So, you can ask, would a meal help? Would it help if I mowed your lawn? Would it help if you went for a walk with me? Would it help to explore solutions? Would it help if I, gave you a call in a couple days just to check in on you, see how you're doing? Um, do you need to feel heard, right? Do you need a chance to talk? Do you want me to listen? Can we talk about the story of the life? Can we talk about the story of the death? Um, you can share your memories of the deceased with that person. Um, and then when we say hug, what we really mean is presence. Sometimes people need a hug. Not everybody's a hugger. So just being there with them. But yeah, just ask the griever, what would be helpful for you now? And you can offer some of these things up because sometimes they're like, well, I don't know. And then you can say, okay, well, I'm gonna have a meal sent to your house. Do you want pizza or, McDonald's, whatever that work or looks like for you? So can we be vulnerable and compassionate in the presence of suffering? Compassion means to suffer together. It's defined as the feeling that arises when you are confronted with another suffering and feel motivated to relieve that suffering. Um, Compassion is wonderful, but it's hard. It's not easy. It's not easy to sit with somebody who is suffering. Being present with someone in pain really does require courage. We have to tolerate our own discomfort in those moments, and we have to resist the urge to fix it or minimize or escape. Um, but grief literacy is hopefully about building that courage, allowing us to be able to sit with those people. So this QR code leads to the University of Utah's webpage on grief literacy. Grief literacy is a goal within the larger Compassionate Communities movement. Um, and so we recognize that our society is fragmented and the varying norms and traditions to support one another in the times of suffering are unclear. Increasing grief knowledge would enable the general public and professionals to identify grief more readily, to seek out relevant information and to adopt appropriate supports, and thereby be proactive in avoiding complications from the grieving process, such as depression. Um, so grief literacy, it's not just about knowing facts about grief. It's about moving from a culture that avoids grief to one that meets it with knowledge, skill, and compassion. So why do we need grief literacy? We need it because grief is universal and our communities are often ill-equipped to respond. Um, Giving people the information that they need in order to respond differently, to show up, to not be afraid, is going to make a world of difference to grievers. So we're going to go ahead and jump ahead here. So how can we support someone who is grieving? We can check in, but we need to check in with ourselves first. So we aren't always equipped to handle grief, especially if, we ourselves are going through something challenging, emotionally draining, all of those things. So check in with yourself and see what you can handle right now, what's okay. And then, you can move forward based on that knowledge, right? You can listen to them. You can help them with practicalities. Um, and then it's important that we take care of ourselves as we take care of others. So connection is really, really important. Again, you don't have to be a therapist to make a difference, but showing up for a meal, a walk, showing up on a hard anniversary, right? I'm going to sound like a broken record, but showing up is important. Okay. Um, I want to leave some time for questions. So you should ha all have the slides. Um, but I'll go ahead. I'm going to share this last one here. So, the shipwreck of grief, it's a metaphor that's often attributed to Laurie Anderson. Um, but she describes grief like this. Grief is like a ship that sinks. At first, the waves are 100 feet tall and crash over you without stopping. You don't know how to swim. After a while, you learn how to swim. The waves are still 100 feet tall, but you see them coming. You know that somehow you will survive. The waves never stop coming, but you learn. You never know what's going to bring them on. And this is just a great description of grief, right? This is really how it feels. At first, it's so overwhelming, but you learn, right? And you end up in a place where you can navigate that. So here are some grief support resources. This is our website at the College of Nursing. So again, you have the slides, so you should be able to go there if you need something. And Helen Keller said, "When it seems that our sorrow is too great to be borne, let us think of the great family of the heavy-hearted, into which our grief has given us entrance. And inevitably we will feel about us their arms, their sympathy, and their understanding." So this is our grief literacy page on Instagram. You're welcome to give us a follow. We just have tips there um, to help. We are very grateful for the people who have contributed to us and offered their support. And then again, here's our contact information, our phone number, our email address. Um, but yeah, I want to open it up. It looks like we have a few minutes. So does anybody have any questions for me?